Should the constitutional right to a fair trial extend to undocumented immigrants accused of serious crimes, such as in the Lake and Riley case, given their unlawful status and potential strain on taxpayer-funded resources? In balancing fiscal responsibility and human rights, is it justified to deny undocumented immigrants access to public defenders, or does this undermine the principles of justice and equality enshrined in the U.S. Constitution? Considering the significant costs associated with undocumented immigration, including law enforcement and public services, should taxpayers bear the burden of legal defense for those who entered the country illegally and are accused of additional crimes?
Welcome back to the Mass Debate channel, where we tackle the tough questions head-on. Today, we delve into the controversial issue of whether undocumented immigrants, like the accused in the Lake and Riley case, should receive taxpayer-funded public defenders. Join us as we explore both sides of this heated debate.
Did you know that in Oklahoma,
Hmm.
they actually have a tax on money sent out of state?
Oh,
It's called a remittance tax,
okay.
and it's the only one of its kind in the whole U.S.,
Interesting.
which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah.
But it actually gets to the heart of what we're looking at today,
Okay.
which is legal representation for undocumented immigrants
Mm-hmm.
and the massive
Hey, wow.
financial ripple effects of illegal immigration.
Okay.
We're going to try to untangle the legal arguments, dive into the financial realities,
Right.
and hopefully help you form a more informed opinion on this super complex issue.
Sounds good.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
It is.
It's fascinating how this one state-level policy
Mm,
opens up a Pandora's box of questions.
totally.
Does it hint at a potential solution to offset the costs of illegal immigration?
Right.
Or is it just a Band-Aid on a much larger wound?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to even begin answering those questions, we need to understand the legal landscape.
Mm-hmm.
You know that old saying, like, if public defenders are free,
Yeah.
how do they get paid?
Right.
Well,
How
it turns out that same question
Yeah.
applies to legal representation for undocumented immigrants.
Okay.
And the answer is a bit more complicated than you might think.
I bet.
It is.
It is, and it really hinges on understanding the different layers of rights
Yes.
and legal proceedings involved.
Right. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
How do public defenders get paid if they're free to the defendant?
It's actually pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Public defenders are government employees,
Okay.
so they receive a salary funded by, you guessed it, taxpayers.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
So when someone can't afford a lawyer,
Right.
they get a public defender.
Uh,
It's the government.
Yep.
And ultimately the taxpayers who are footing the bill.
Exactly. And this whole system is rooted in the Sixth Amendment,
Okay.
which guarantees everyone the right to an attorney in criminal proceedings. It's a cornerstone of our justice system.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
And where those Oklahoma remittances start to feel relevant again.
All right.
What about undocumented immigrants?
Yeah.
Do they have the same constitutional rights when it comes to legal representation?
This is where things get murky.
Okay.
The Sixth Amendment specifically applies to criminal proceedings,
Okay.
but immigration cases are considered civil matters.
Ah, so there's a loophole.
Not exactly a loophole,
Okay.
but a distinct legal category.
Gotcha.
However,
Yeah.
the 14th Amendment,
Okay.
specifically the Equal Protection Clause,
Mm-hmm.
comes into play here.
All right.
It guarantees everyone within U.S. jurisdiction,
Okay.
regardless of documentation status,
Yeah.
equal protection under the law.
Okay, so even though they're undocumented,
Right.
they're still protected by the Constitution.
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
For example, if an undocumented immigrant is sued in civil court,
Okay.
say for a car accident or an unpaid debt, they have the absolute right to defend themselves.
It would be totally unfair to hold someone accountable for
Right.
breaking a law if they weren't even allowed to defend themselves, right?
Exactly. And that same principle applies to other constitutional rights.
Okay.
Undocumented immigrants have protection against unreasonable search and seizure, the right not to self-incriminate, and they can even file lawsuits under certain circumstances.
But what about specifically in immigration proceedings?
Yeah.
What kind of legal rights do they have there?
They do have the right to a hearing in immigration court to argue against deportation.
Okay.
This is where they can present their case and try to demonstrate why they should be allowed to stay in the country.
That seems fair.
Uh-huh.
Everyone deserves a chance to plead their case.
Right.
But are there any exceptions to this right?
There are a couple of key exceptions.
Okay.
One is expedited removal, which applies to individuals caught within 100 miles of the border
Okay.
and within 14 days of entering illegally.
So if they're caught quickly after crossing the border,
Right.
they might not get a full hearing.
That's right. And there's another exception.
Go ahead.
If someone has already been deported once and tries to re-enter illegally,
Yeah.
they're typically not granted another hearing.
Wow. That's a tough situation to be in.
It is.
So they have the right to a hearing in most cases.
Right.
But not always.
Not always.
What about the right to an attorney in immigration court?
That right exists.
Okay.
But here's the catch.
Yeah.
The government is not obligated to pay for that attorney.
Hold on. They have the right to a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
but they have to pay for it themselves.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem very fair, especially considering many undocumented immigrants
Right.
might not have the resources to hire legal help.
It's definitely a huge hurdle, and it raises some serious ethical questions about equal access to justice.
Right.
Thankfully, several nonprofit legal aid organizations specialize in representing undocumented immigrants facing deportation. These organizations often rely on volunteer lawyers and donations to provide these crucial services.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So while the government might not provide a lawyer, there are other avenues for legal representation.
There are.
But this whole situation begs the question.
Yeah.
Should undocumented immigrants have access to public defenders?
This is where we move beyond just the legal technicalities and into a much broader debate.
Yeah.
One that weighs ethical considerations and economic realities.
Right.
There are strong arguments on both sides, and it's essential to understand both to form an educated opinion.
Okay, let's unpack those arguments.
All right.
Let's start with the case for providing public defenders to undocumented immigrants.
Okay.
What are some of the main points?
One of the most compelling arguments is rooted in the very principles of due process and equal protection under the law. Supporters argue that everyone, regardless of citizenship status, deserves a fair chance to defend themselves in court.
I can see that it wouldn't be a just system if some people were denied legal representation.
Right.
Simply because of their immigration status.
Precisely. And this ties into the argument for ensuring fairness and impartiality in the justice system. Providing public defenders could help prevent discrimination based solely on someone's documentation or lack thereof.
It's about leveling the playing field, so to speak.
Exactly. And proponents also point to the potential benefits for judicial efficiency. When defendants are properly represented, it can help streamline the process, avoiding unnecessary delays, disruptions, and even appeals.
Yeah.
This could ultimately save time and resources for the entire system.
So it's not just about fairness for the individual.
Right.
It's about making the whole legal process run more smoothly.
That's a key argument, yes. And finally, there's the perspective that providing legal representation for all aligns with international human rights standards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations, explicitly states that everyone has the right to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. This suggests that denying legal representation based on immigration status might conflict with broader global principles of justice.
So this isn't just a U.S. issue. It's a global conversation about human rights.
Exactly.
And access to a fair trial.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some compelling arguments for providing public defenders. But let's flip the script.
Okay.
What are the main arguments against it?
Resource allocation is often cited as a major concern. Opponents argue that public funds should prioritize citizens. And providing legal services to undocumented immigrants could strain an already stretched budget.
Right, especially when you consider the potential costs associated with illegal immigration. Speaking of which, let's dive into the fiscal side of things.
Okay.
What kind of impact does illegal immigration have on the U.S. economy?
This is where things get really interesting. Right.
And this is where that Oklahoma remittance tax becomes a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
According to the Federation for American Immigration Reform, illegal immigration costs U.S. taxpayers over $150 billion annually.
Wow. $150 billion a year.
Yeah.
I knew it was a lot.
It's a lot.
But that's mind-blowing.
It is.
Where does all that money go?
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's not just about building walls.
You're right. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah.
Education is a huge factor.
Okay.
A big chunk of that money. Roughly $77 billion
wow.
goes towards public schools specifically for K-12 education, English language instruction, and support programs for students from immigrant families.
Okay.
And then there's healthcare.
Right.
While undocumented immigrants are generally not eligible for programs like Medicare and Medicaid, they still receive medical care.
Yeah.
Often in emergency rooms.
Yeah.
Which drives up costs significantly.
Yeah, of course. The estimated annual cost for healthcare for undocumented immigrants is around $26.7 billion.
So taxpayers are essentially covering those healthcare expenses.
Right.
Even if it's not through direct government programs.
That's the reality. Yes. And then there's the cost of justice enforcement.
Okay.
This includes incarceration, ICE operations,
Right.
Border Patrol legal proceedings, and even federal programs that reimburse states for the costs of imprisoning undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes. This category totals around $25.1 billion per year.
Okay.
And we can't forget about welfare programs.
Right.
While undocumented immigrants are largely ineligible for direct benefits, their U.S.-born children are citizens and therefore eligible for programs like SNAP, TNF, WIC school lunches, and child care assistance.
Yeah.
The cost of these programs for families of undocumented immigrants is estimated at $11.5 billion annually.
Wow. It all adds up quickly.
It does.
And that $150 billion figure is a net cost, right?
Yeah.
Meaning it already factors in any taxes paid by undocumented immigrants.
Precisely so. While they do contribute some tax revenue,
Correct.
It's nowhere near enough to offset the overall costs they incur.
Okay, so we're talking about a significant financial burden on U.S. taxpayers.
We are.
But beyond these figures,
can
you give us some concrete examples
of
how these costs play out in the real world?
Absolutely.
I mean, how does this actually affect people on the ground?
One of the biggest challenges is actually getting a clear picture of the costs.
Okay.
Due to a lack of transparency in government reporting. This makes it difficult to assess the situation accurately, and can even fuel speculation about potential biases or hidden agendas.
So it's hard to have a productive conversation when we don't even have all the facts on the table.
Exactly, and then you have the frustration bubbling up at the state level.
Okay.
Particularly in states like Texas and Arizona that share a border with Mexico.
Yeah.
These states are pouring billions of dollars into border security because they feel the federal government isn't doing enough.
Right.
They're essentially having to pick up the slack, and it's straining their budgets and fueling political tensions.
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are.
Trying to protect their borders and manage their resources while facing pressure from both sides of the immigration debate.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that Oklahoma remittance tax.
Yeah.
It's a small but significant example of how policymakers are grappling with these complex financial questions.
You know, that's a perfect segue to our next section.
Okay.
We've covered the legal basics and the economic realities.
Right.
Now, I want to get into the nitty-gritty of those arguments for and against public defenders.
All right.
And I'm especially interested in exploring the international human rights angle. You mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
But are there any specific examples or treaties that solidify the right to counsel for everyone?
Yes.
Regardless of immigration status?
There are, and it's a fascinating area to explore.
Okay.
But before we jump into that, I think it's crucial to hear from those on the front lines.
Okay.
The legal aid organizations working directly with undocumented immigrants.
Right.
They have a unique perspective on the challenges and complexities of this issue.
You're right. We can't just talk about numbers and legal theories.
Right.
We need to understand the human impact of these policies.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears and dive into some real-world examples.
Absolutely. Let's zoom in on a resource from the Greater Hartford Legal Aid and New Haven Legal Assistance organizations.
Okay.
They've put together a sort of cheat sheet outlining various scenarios an undocumented immigrant might face.
Okay.
And the legal options available.
Oh, that's interesting. I imagine it's like a roadmap
for
navigating this complex legal maze.
It is.
What kind of of stuff does it cover?
It emphasizes understanding those finer points we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Like whether someone is classified as an arriving alien.
Right.
And how that impacts their rights.
Right, because those arriving aliens caught within a specific time frame.
Yeah.
And proximity to the border can be subject to expedited removal.
Right.
Which means they don't have the same due process protections as other undocumented immigrants.
Exactly. The cheat sheet also stresses the importance of understanding the specific circumstances of someone's entry into the U.S.
Okay.
And their criminal history, if any.
Yeah.
It's about assessing their vulnerability and figuring out the best legal strategy for each individual case.
It sounds like this resource is invaluable for both the individuals facing deportation.
It is.
And the legal aid organizations trying to help them.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of legal expertise in these situations. Imagine trying to navigate the immigration system without legal representation.
Yeah.
It'd be like trying to sail through a hurricane without a compass.
You're telling me it's a recipe for disaster?
It is.
Okay, so we've explored the constitutional rights of undocumented immigrants, the arguments for and against public defenders, and the mind-boggling financial impact of illegal immigration.
It is mind-boggling.
But as we've said,
this
is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There are so many layers to this issue.
There are.
As you continue your research, I encourage you to think critically about the information you encounter.
Absolutely.
Question the sources.
Yeah.
Consider different perspectives and be open to challenging your own assumptions.
I agree.
Right? It's easy to get caught up in the emotional side of this issue.
It is.
But we need to ground ourselves in facts and logic.
Right.
While also recognizing the human stories at the heart of it all.
Exactly.
Right. Speaking of which, let's shift our focus to the policy-making process itself.
Okay.
We have a transcript from a recent congressional hearing on the fiscal costs of illegal immigration.
Congressional hearings are always fascinating. They bring together such a wide range of perspectives.
They do.
And offer a glimpse into how policy decisions are made. What did this particular hearing focus on?
It zeroed in on the economic burden of illegal immigration, with testimony from a variety of experts, including a director from the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank.
The Heritage Foundation is known for their research and advocacy on immigration, often leaning towards stricter controls. I'm curious to hear their take.
Their testimony really hammered home the costs to taxpayers.
Okay.
They cited a figure of over $150 billion per year, which aligns with the data from the Federation for American Immigration Reform that we discussed earlier.
So there seems to be a general agreement on the overall cost, at least among these sources, but I'm more interested in their specific insights or recommendations. Did they offer any potential solutions?
They did. One of their key points was that this financial burden is largely preventable.
Okay.
They argued that stricter border control and enforcement of existing immigration laws could significantly reduce these costs.
That's a common argument from those advocating for stricter immigration policies.
Right.
But we have to consider the potential trade-offs. Increased border security can be incredibly expensive and often raises concerns about civil liberties.
Exactly. There's no easy solution. The congressional testimony also highlighted the difficulty of getting accurate data on the costs of illegal immigration, criticizing the lack of transparency in government reporting. They argued that this makes it almost impossible to make informed policy decisions.
That's a valid point, trying to develop effective and responsible policies without a clear understanding of the true costs. It's like trying to build a house without knowing the dimensions of the foundation.
Right.
It's a recipe for instability.
And speaking of instability, they also touched on the issue of remittances.
Right.
Which, as we've discussed, represents a significant outflow of money from the U.S. economy.
Right. They even suggested exploring a nationwide remittance tax similar to what Oklahoma has done to try and recoup some of that lost revenue.
It's a bold idea, but like any policy proposal, it needs to be weighed carefully. What are the potential benefits? What are the potential drawbacks? Could it be implemented fairly and effectively?
Those are exactly the questions we should be asking. And this brings us to another important resource, a report from the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR.
We've referenced FAIR a few times already. I'm eager to dig into their report and see what they emphasize.
They're known for their in-depth research on immigration issues, often advocating for stricter controls. Their report offers a detailed breakdown of the costs of illegal immigration at both the federal and state levels, categorizing expenses in areas like education, healthcare, law enforcement, and welfare
So they're really getting granular with the data, showing us exactly where those billions of dollars are being spent.
They are.
That level of detail can be incredibly eye-opening.
It can, and the report really drives home the strain that illegal immigration puts on public resources.
Yeah.
Especially in those states with larger undocumented populations.
I'm sure they also address the counter-argument that undocumented immigrants contribute to the economy through the taxes they pay.
They do acknowledge those tax contributions,
Okay.
but argue that they're dwarfed by the overall expenses they maintain, that the net cost of illegal immigration far outweighs any revenue generated through taxes.
Which aligns with what we've discussed earlier. It's a complex equation with no easy answers. Did they also delve into the economic impact of remittances?
Absolutely. They estimate that billions of dollars flow out of the country each year through remittances, impacting spending within the U.S. and affecting local economies.
It's fascinating how different sources, even those with varying perspectives, converge on certain points.
Right.
The issue of remittances seems to be a recurring theme in this whole discussion.
It is. It highlights how interconnected this issue is, extending beyond U.S. borders and encompassing the global flow of people and money.
Okay, so this FAIR report gives a comprehensive analysis of the economic costs. But we have to remember that every source...
Absolutely. No single report or study can capture the full complexity of this issue.
Right.
It's crucial to engage with a variety of sources, question assumptions, and critically evaluate the evidence.
You know, this whole conversation about remittances and their impact on local economies brings to mind a story I read recently about a small town in Nebraska that was struggling economically.
Oh, really?
A meatpacking plant, which had been a major employer, shut down, leaving a lot of people out of work.
Oh, wow.
A few years later, another company opened a similar plant in the same town.
Okay.
But this time, many of the jobs went to undocumented immigrants.
Interesting.
And while it did revitalize the local economy to some extent, a lot of the money earned by those workers was sent back to their home countries through remittances.
So while the town saw some economic benefits, there was also this outflow of capital that might have otherwise circulated within the community.
Exactly.
It just illustrates how this issue plays out in very real ways, affecting individuals, families, and entire communities.
It does.
It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right.
It's about people's livelihoods and the ripple effects of economic policies.
It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just abstract debates. There are human stories behind every statistic and every policy decision.
Okay, so we've explored the legal arguments, the economic realities, and even glimpsed into the policymaking process. But we still haven't addressed your earlier point about international human rights and the right to counsel.
Okay.
Are there any specific examples or treaties that bolster that argument?
There are. One notable example is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which has been ratified by over 170 countries, including the United States. Article 14 of this covenant explicitly states that everyone charged with a criminal offense has the right to a fair and public hearing by a competent, independent, and impartial tribunal established by law. Okay, so that clearly establishes the right to a fair trial in criminal cases.
Yes.
But how does that apply to immigration proceedings, which are considered civil matters in the U.S.?
That's a crucial question. While the covenant doesn't explicitly mention immigration proceedings, many legal scholars argue that the principle of a fair hearing should extend to all situations where someone's liberty is at stake.
So even though immigration cases are classified as civil matters in the U.S., the broader principles of international human rights law suggest that those facing deportation should still be afforded the right to a fair hearing and legal representation.
That's the argument, and it's one that's gaining traction in legal circles and international courts, in fact.
Wow.
The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that denying legal aid to asylum seekers in certain circumstances can violate their right to a fair hearing.
So there's a growing international consensus that the right to legal representation should not be limited by immigration status, even in civil proceedings. That's fascinating. It really broadens the scope of this conversation.
It does.
And challenges us to consider the U.S. legal system within a global context.
Exactly. And it brings us back to that fundamental question. Should undocumented immigrants have access to public defenders?
It's a question with no easy answers, but one that deserves careful consideration. We've examined the legal and ethical arguments, the economic realities, and the international human rights perspective. Now it's time to synthesize all this information and explore some potential paths forward.
It feels like we've been circling around this question, uncovering all these different facets, and it's clear there's no easy answer. But that's what makes this such a compelling deep dive, right?
It does.
It pushes us to think critically and grapple with those gray areas.
And it's striking how this issue often gets framed as a binary choice.
Yeah.
Either you're for providing public defenders to undocumented immigrants or you're against it.
Right.
But the reality is far more nuanced. There's a whole spectrum of potential approaches, and each one comes with its own set of considerations and potential consequences.
You're absolutely right. It's not about picking a side.
Yeah.
It's about finding solutions that address the complexities of the situation while upholding our values and principles.
Exactly. So let's step back for a moment.
Okay.
And consider some of those potential paths forward. We've talked about the strain on resources, the importance of due process, the economic realities, and the global human rights context. Where do we go from here?
One approach that's gaining traction is the idea of a tiered system for legal representation, based on the severity of the charges and the individual's vulnerability, for example. Someone facing minor immigration violations might be given access to legal resources and guidance, while those facing more serious charges or those who are particularly vulnerable, like asylum seekers or unaccompanied minors, would be provided with a public defender.
That sounds like a more targeted approach, focusing resources where they're most needed.
Right.
While still acknowledging the right to due process for everyone, it seems like a potential compromise.
It does.
Between those advocating for full access to public defenders and those concerned about resource allocation.
It is, and it also allows for flexibility and adaptation based on the specific circumstances of each case.
Yeah.
Another approach that's been suggested is increasing funding for legal aid organizations. This would allow them to expand their services and reach more undocumented immigrants who need legal assistance without necessarily placing the full burden on the government to provide public defenders.
That's an interesting idea. It seems like a more indirect way to address the issue.
Yeah.
Empowering those organizations that are already on the ground and doing the work.
Right.
But wouldn't that still require significant public funding?
It would, and that's where the debate about priorities comes in.
Right.
It's a question of how we allocate our resources as a society. Do we prioritize border security and enforcement? Do we invest in social programs and legal aid? These are difficult choices, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
And of course, any discussion about funding has to be grounded in a realistic understanding of the economic realities.
Yes.
We've seen that illegal immigration carries significant costs, but we also have to consider the potential economic contributions of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah.
It's a complex equation.
It is, and it's one that requires careful analysis and thoughtful debate.
Yeah.
We need to move beyond simplistic arguments and engage with the nuances of this issue. We need to ask tough questions about costs and benefits, individual rights, and societal impacts.
One of the things that struck me throughout this deep dive is how much misinformation and fear-mongering surrounds this issue. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and lose sight of the human element.
You're right. It's essential to approach this issue with empathy and compassion, remembering that we're talking about real people's lives.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about finding solutions that align with our values as a nation. Fairness, justice, and opportunity for all.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to the listener.
Okay.
And leave them with something to ponder. We've examined the legal, ethical, and fiscal aspects of this complex issue.
We have.
Now, the question for you is, what do you think is the most responsible way to approach legal representation for undocumented immigrants?
That's a great question.
How do we balance individual rights with societal impacts?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that each of us needs to grapple with, using the information we've gathered, our own values, and our understanding of the world around us.
This deep dive has been about giving you the tools to form your own informed opinion.
Exactly.
But the conversation doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep engaging in thoughtful dialogue.
It's through these ongoing conversations that we can move closer to finding solutions that are both just and practical.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Step into the court as the lights glare bright. Questions arise about what's fair or right. People divided, it's a fight or flight. Who's in the wrong and who's got the right? They say justice blind, but can we see the line? Taxpayer dollars, what they going to define. Stories of crimes and tales they unwind. Public defenders, rights intertwined. Innocent of grouping like justice play its role. Voices of the voices, let the story unfold. Balance from the scales, let them have their say. In the land of freedom is the whole.